Welcome to Managing Your Research Data. My name is Janet Rothney. I'm the Research Data Management Librarian here at the University of Manitoba. So, objectives today, we are planning to review some basic research data management theories, including the FAIR guiding principles. We're going to learn a little bit about current and forthcoming RDM requirements in Canada. And I hope you'll have time to reflect on how you practice research data management now and where you might consider incorporating some new tools or new procedures. So sometimes when I say that, people think that they don't do research data management. But really, if you've ever named a file and put it somewhere on your computer, that's part of what this is all about. So we're really kind of talking about keeping control of your documentation in connection to research and other places in your life, thinking about storage, sharing, and access considerations. And we'll kind of get into a few other more specific components, but really we all do this. It's just about doing it more transparently now that people like funders and publishers are interested in making sure that we're doing it comprehensively. I should mention, if you guys have questions, you can pop them into the chat anytime. I will try and answer them as I go along. I do have a quick poll that I think I'll be able to pull up. It's these are the 4 questions. And so basically, where are you coming from in terms of familiarity? If you're working on a research project right now, what's your connection to that? Do you have requirements in your current situation? Are you working with funder requirements? Is your PI talking to you about stuff like this, or your advisor? And then I'm just curious if you guys have been participating in the series over the week. No wrong answers here at all. And obviously everything here is anonymous. I'll share the results in a minute. Okay, maybe 5-10 more seconds. If you are doing 10 other things at once, that's totally fine. Often my webinar experience. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and I will share the results. So most people here are new to research data management. That's very, very common, especially if you are graduate students, which is this series is part of that kind of outreach assistant. So lots of research assistants here, great. A few principal investigators, welcome. No project, that's okay. A couple people who have different roles. So there's lots of people who are involved in research in different ways. People like me, people like statisticians, people that you would bring in for a short amount of time or consult before you start the project. And often they're interested in the same kinds of conversations that you are. Most people are not working with requirements. Very common at the moment. People are sort of gearing up to prepare. A couple people are working with funder publishers, and some people have some requirements from their advisors and PIs. Yeah, really common. Okay, and sort of a mix of attendance for the graduate student research series. So none of this content is directly related to other parts of the series. I was just curious kind of where people are coming from. Thank you for playing along. We will move on. Okay, so let's start from the beginning. Let's talk about what is data, or what are data. It's a word that can be singular and plural. So data are facts, measurements, recordings, records, or observations collected by researchers and others with a minimum of contextual interpretation. So data generally is considered before you do anything with it, before you make a chart, before you confirm a hypothesis. It's just the materials that you're using to ask a question. Data may be in any format or medium. So very broad in terms of it could be numbers, it could be measurements from a research instrument gathering steps in a day or something like that. It can be images, it can be interviews. So when we talk about research data, more specifically, they're data that are used as primary sources to support technical or scientific inquiry, research scholarship, or creative practice. So this is a quote from the Tri-Agency's Research Data Management Policy. Tri-Agencies is the three big funders from a national level from Canada. So CIHR, NSERC, and SSHRC. They represent the health group, the science group, and the social sciences and humanities. And they are really one of the big drivers of this conversation right now in Canada because they are starting to require some discussion of research data management in funding applications and things like that. So now that we kind of understand what data might be, then what is research data management? So it's really encompassing the processes applied throughout the life cycle of a research project. And if life cycle is a word you haven't heard before, we're going to talk about it in a minute, to guide the collection, documentation, storage, sharing, and preservation of research data. And it's really sort of designed to allow researchers to find and access data. So why do we do this? What's the point of being here today? So there's a couple of important external factors. If you are interested in participating in open scholarship, if you believe in those kinds of ideals, that you would share research to as many people as possible for the most benefit. There are some specific principles that we'll talk about in a minute, including FAIR, OCAP, and CARE. Those are all acronyms that we'll get into. And then this is something we talk about kind of as a carrot versus stick situation. So some people only come to this when they are required, and funders are the ones that are often pushing that agenda. I will argue that there are a number of internal factors that make this work worth it. So it really helps to get and stay organized with your research teams, especially if you're working with a large or distributed team. So if you have people from all over Canada, all over the world, it's just a little easier if have a document that we can all look at, right? It helps to increase your data security. Big conversation in Canada in the last couple of years about data security, especially as we're moving more and more to digital-only content. It can increase your citing and metrics. So if you're a new researcher, if you're concerned about promotion and tenure, things like that, or getting a job after your master's degree, it can help you kind of get some more traction in terms of readers and users of your work. And it really helps to ensure that you're in control of your choices at each stage of the research. So thinking about these things as early as possible means you're not going to close a door that you weren't anticipating to be closed. So one of the main sort of guiding principles of research data management is these FAIR guiding principles. They do come out of science, but have been sort of adapted across all disciplines. Sometimes that's a question I put on my poll, what discipline you're from. But really, research data management affects everybody. So FAIR stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. It was developed in 2016 specifically for digital data. You can see the two links there. The Go FAIR principles kind of talks about a little bit more about what these things are and how we do them. And the DOI document link at the bottom is the original statement from 2016. So findable, this is probably a simpler of the four. So making your data possible to find, basically making it searchable. So we talk about metadata, data about data, things like a title, an author, a publisher, a year, all of those kinds of things. Housing your material in a repository that gets crawled by Google or something like that. using persistent identifiers like DOIs, digital object identifiers, which is, you'll often see them for journal articles if you're reading those for school. When we talk about accessible, I'm thinking about storing data in open file formats and or with some information on how to access the content if needed. So if you are sharing data that can only be analyzed by a proprietary analysis tool like SPSS, you would include that information along with your data. Interoperable, sort of connected to accessible. So we're talking about information, storing your information in ways that can be used by multiple file formats. So open data, again, is a good option, or an additional option. So if you have that proprietary, then you also host it in open formats. And then reusable. So in order to reuse data, we need to be transparent about how you process the data to begin with, and include things like a README file, human readable file names, column descriptions, all of those kinds of things. And so the last thing I'll talk about here is, so I talk a lot about data reuse in this whole session, and it's not necessarily the only reason to do research data management or to kind of invest some time in this. But remember that that can also mean you, the researcher, in 2 years. When you've published your paper, it's out in the world, and you think, maybe I'm going to like tag on another little project, or maybe I want to share something more fully with somebody who I'm working with in my postdoc, something like that. It can be really hard to remember all the little details, all the decisions that you make in the data analysis phase, right? Or even in the writing phase. So if the only person you're interested in taking care of is yourself, that's okay. This will still be useful for you as a researcher. So this is a slightly different focus, but I think it's really important, especially in Canada, especially in Manitoba, especially in Winnipeg. So OCAP and CARE are principles of Indigenous data sovereignty. OCAP is a Canadian organization, and CARE comes from a global Indigenous perspective, a group called GIDA. They're similar but different. So we're talking about ownership, control, access, and possession, or collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. So these principles specifically address data relating to Indigenous people and lands, attempts to reclaim community protections for community product, and redress past harms around research practices. So there's been a lot of poorly done research with these groups, and we're trying to change it. You may have heard of the concept of nothing about us without us, and that really kind of centers the people that you're working with need to be part of all of these kinds of decisions, right? Where does something get stored? Who gets to access it? When do they get to do that? How do they get to use that work, right? So there are other principles that might be relevant. So if you are working with an Indigenous community or on Indigenous lands, you may want to just kind of not assume that they're going to use OCAP just because they're Canadian. They might have something specific and different, but really try and have this conversation as early as possible and bring them along with you. And the last thing I'll mention here is there are efforts underway in many jurisdictions, including the University of Manitoba, to repatriate data and artifacts that were wrongfully taken from communities in the name of research. And this is really connected to these kinds of principles. If you're curious about this kind of work, or if you think this might impact future projects that you have, I'm always happy to talk about this a little more. Back to requirements. So I mentioned the tri-agency already. They published a RDM policy in 2021. It has 3 components. The first is an institutional strategy requirement, and that's a university level requirement. So anybody who administers funds was required to produce a strategy. Ours is here. I don't know if I mentioned this already, but everything that's underlined in this slide deck is a link So you can go there and check it out. And that web page kind of gets updated as we make changes. The data management plan requirement is a researcher level requirement, so your responsibility. It's required with application documents, and they are starting to be included in the assessment of an application. So they're not just, you have to have one, and as long as you have one, you're good. There's a link here to the current application with requirements, with a caveat that this list doesn't get updated all that often. CIHR is the one that is making changes more rapidly. So just make sure you're reading your application documentation, check and see if there's a data management component to your application. And the third component of this policy is a data sharing requirement that covers data supporting publication. So this is kind of in relation to the open access requirement. So if you get funding from the tri-agencies, you're required to share a free version of your publications within 12 months of publishing. The data sharing is kind of an additional component, but the same idea there. We have not started doing this yet. An announcement is expected, possibly by the end of the year. They're running out of time. It might be an early 2025 thing. And once that gets announced, then it'll be new grants after a specific date. There's still lots and lots of questions about data sharing. We'll talk about it a little bit today, but I don't have a whole lot of answers. So I mentioned data management plans, or DMPs. They are a document that gathers gathers information about how you plan to manage your research data during the active, sharing, and preservation stages of a project. So you might include details on the strategies, tools, and people involved in securing and storing your research data. DMPs are generally written during the planning stages of a project. And they may be required, as I mentioned, for funding or similar processes like ethics applications. DMP should be considered a living document, so things will change over time, hopefully not drastically, but maybe you say, I'm planning to host all my data in SharePoint, and 16 months from now, we change our platforms, right? And then you'll have to make a new choice. So a lot of the things that go into a data management plan probably already exist in your normal practices, laboratory norms, something that's written on a whiteboard that all the research assistants have to follow, advisor or department expectations, ethics regulations, all of those kinds of things. It's the new part is putting it in a document. When is a DMP required? So here's a couple of specific examples of when this is required in Canada. These are the three agencies. CIHR has multiple smaller and focused funding calls. NSERC is just working with the subatomic physics group, and SSHRC is working with partnership grants stage 2. The idea is that they will roll more and more grants in as they move along. They started in the 2022-23 granting cycle. And the pink link here is the SSHRC organization has developed some guidance on data management plans. So if you're looking at specifically tri-agency funding data management plans, you may want to just make sure you're matching what their expectations are versus what I'm emphasizing, right? So if you're working with funding that doesn't come from the tri-agencies or comes from outside of Canada, there are other groups that are working with requirements, a number of them in the United States. So the NIH, National Institute of Health, all of their grants as of last January require. And there's a couple other organizations that use DMPs. And then there's lots of UK and global funding agencies as well. So if you're working with funding and you're not sure what the plan is, we're always happy to talk about it. I will mention, I'll mention this a ton of times, but so there's 2 more related sessions to RDM that you guys might have already signed up for. One's next Tuesday. It goes into some of the tools that we'll talk about today as sort of theoretically, we'll get in there and play around. And then the other one on the 28th of November is a writing data management plans session. So if you know this is coming for you, you may want to come to that session. Again, data sharing requirements, that third component. Right now, it's really being led by publishers and some domains. What I mean by that is like the genetics people always share. The certain groups in science are very sharing focused because they will collaborate and use each other's data and make bigger pronouncements with the data that's been gathered in multiple places. In the future, obviously, funders are going to get involved. And I want to be clear that there will always be some data that is never completely open, never shared widely. And that can involve human ethics. So if you're working with vulnerable populations, identifiable people that are just not willing to, be on camera, for example, and that would harm your recruitment, that people wouldn't come and do your research project with you if they knew that their work would be shared. Indigenous data rights is definitely part of this. And there's a couple other sort of scenarios. Intellectual property, you might want to delay until you launch your whatever thing you're building, that kind of stuff. So at the publisher level, we are seeing more and more publisher requirements for data to be shared. For example, if you publish a manuscript and it's accepted to the journal, they'll also want you to share either a data file with supplemental information, and you've probably seen these as you read papers for school, or they will want you to post that work somewhere and send them a link to the document. And that's happening more and more. They want you to post it in your own repository, local repository or something like that. And then just link to it, because then they don't have to take care of it, right? So there's a lot of discussion about data sharing, as I mentioned, a lot of concern around making sharing useful for everybody, making sure the infrastructure is there in Canada, that it's not going to cost the researchers a ton of money to do this, and also to protect folks so that research can still happen, that people are willing to still participate. So I'm sure there will be quite a bit of discussion about this over the next year and a half. And there already is lots of pilots about how do we share data securely, things like that. So I've just thrown a whole bunch of theory at you. We're just going to take a quick pause and then we're going to keep going. But there are a lot of links on the research data management at the library's webpage, which is linked here. We're going to get into some of that in a minute. The Alliance RDM content, primers and brief guides are really nice, especially if you just need like a snapshot of what am I supposed to do here. The Alliance is a group that's Canadian. It's called the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, if you're using their full name. And they include people like me, high performance computing folks, data security people, lots of different focuses on data. And we kind of all work together with universities and also outside of a university complex. And if you're just interested in finding more research content or RDM content, there's a ton of it out there in the world. It's easy to Google and find like a YouTube page or whatever. One thing that I kind of like is that the MIT has some nice workshops and they share all their slides. So if there's something more specific that you're looking for that we don't get into here, that's another option for you. Okay. So now we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about RDM in practice. And this is the part where I want you to think about, like, what do I do now? Or what do I know about now in each of these phases of research? And what seems like something I can start incorporating. So it's not necessarily that you have to do all of this all at once for every single project, but sort of like start wading into the water, right? I mentioned the research lifecycle pretty early on. So this is one way to look at it. It's just really a way to organize and describe the stages of research. In this image, it's presented linearly. as if you do one thing, you finish it, and then you do the next component. Um, Usually it's messier than that and often a little bit circular. You might do a little bit of planning, you might do a little bit of creation, you might, kind of move back and forth between those stages. Similarly, you might be publishing and preserving around the same time. And considerations for reuse sort of happen all the way through. This image that we're looking at here comes from the Research Services Lifecycle webpage, which is a group that I'm involved with here, other librarians that I work with. And so it's just another way to navigate our services. So if you look at the research data management page and it feels too linear or like not enough content, or you don't know which ones to use when, you might want to try this page. Very similar content, just organized differently. So our session for the rest of the time we have together is sort of following these 5 stages. I'm going to use slightly different terminology for each of the stages, but this is what we're looking at. And you will probably encounter along the way other life cycle images that are more complex, less complex. So that's fine. 5 is what we're working with today. All right. If anybody has questions about anything, also now might be a good time to throw them in just before you forget, because we're getting into a whole other component of research, data management. So the first phase is planning, design, and starting up a project. So some things you might be doing at this stage are thinking about who you want to be on your team. Or if you're a research assistant, you're maybe applying for a job that's been posted about a new project. You're working on project design. What kind of methods am I going to use? What kind of data am I trying to gather? Where do I need to go to get that kind of information? Do I need to travel? All of those kinds of considerations. And maybe some initial documentation. Maybe you're sketching out a survey or talking to people in a community that, have the kind of fish you want to look at. Something like that. You might be considering a funding application. You might be looking at ethics approval if you're working with humans. If you are, you'll probably need to consider a consent form so that participants understand what they're doing and how their content is going to be shared or used in that project. And you're probably thinking about participant recruitment. How am I going to find the people that I want to talk to? There's many, many, many components to all of these phases. These are just some kind of highlight examples. So when we're talking about this stage, here are some things that in RDM world relate to this stage. And really what we're talking about in the planning stage is a data management plan. It really kind of lays out all of these decisions that you're making, and hopefully is a document that the whole team participates in developing and has access to over time, so that people can refer back, make sure that they are all following the same stuff or making changes when they're necessary. So you're thinking about things like who is responsible for what, who's going to do the backups, who's going to hold the files in their filing cabinet that can't be put on SharePoint or something. You're thinking about where am I going to store my data? Do the people who need it have access to it from that location? Do I need to make some changes there? Really simple things like team norms for file naming. If we're going to have a bunch of research assistants coming in and putting files in or touching files and analyzing them, how are we going to know who did what? Is everyone going to get a folder? Are we going to put initials at the end of the file name? All of those kinds of really little pieces. And thinking about data sharing intentions or requirements. So again, if you are working with funding or if you're working with a community that might not want something shared, you need to kind of get a handle on that before you start doing it, right? And then considering any ethical or legal implications. So some supports that we can talk about from the University of Manitoba or from Canada, the DMP assistant, which is something we'll talk about a lot in those other two sessions that I talked about coming up. It's a Canadian-based DMP template tool. So it kind of gives you a number of questions that you can think about and fill out without having to like pull them out of the air. There's also sort of a collaborative function, so you can have people from multiple places come in and look at the same document. There's a number of templates in this tool. One of them is new this summer, and it's a template for the funding stage specifically. So obviously, if you're working on a DMP before you started your project, before you know how much money you're going to have, you're not necessarily going to know all the super specific things, right? And I should mention that a lot of people over time develop a DMP for their lab or for their project, and then they keep refining and changing that. So most of the time, the hardest DMP is the very first one, right? Because you're writing something down that you've never really thought through specifically. And then the next ones, the subsequent ones, you're just modifying, editing, making some changes to things that didn't work or things that you forgot about. There are other DMP templates. Survey-based research, for example, has one. And just a note that DMP review is available from the university. We'll talk about that more specifically, obviously, in the other sessions. Other things that I get asked for quite frequently are example DMPs. So when you haven't written one before, it's always nice to look at other ones. They're not commonly like out there in the world because often they're part of funding applications, or people are a little concerned about sharing sort of preliminary discussion, right? So there are some from the Alliance, and then there's also a database of them that are shared through McMaster. In that database, you can search for maybe methods that you're looking at using, topics. So if you're working in forestry, you can see if there's other DMPs that have been published. It's Canadian and American, so some of that content may or may not be specifically, you might not necessarily be able to copy and paste, but you should get an idea of kind of what other people have done. Okay, so that's planning, step one. Data collection, storage, and management. This is sometimes what people call the fun part. So right now you are gathering your data. Maybe you are collecting existing data, so big data that's been published on the web already, and you're going to take a look at it. Maybe it's Canadian statistics kind of documentation. Maybe you're gathering samples. Maybe you're out in the wild, which is always fun. Or maybe you're sending out a survey, doing focus groups, talking about interviews, those kinds of things. This stage also includes data analysis, which can take a lot of time. It encompasses any kind of data analysis that you might be looking at: qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods. All of those approaches have research data management components to them. And you're also kind of thinking about different team members will have different duties in this stage. So while not everybody might be involved in collecting data, maybe there's a team that's just doing the analysis, or some folks like that statistician who's just coming in to guide this one phase of the project and then flying out, doing something else. So because of that, it's a very active stage. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of things coming in to the project. There's a lot of things going out of the project. So you really want to keep track of who's touching what are they doing? Do I have all the files that I need? So this is, if you did have somebody who was keeping an eye on things, this would be a moment where they'd be quite busy, right? They're looking at where all the data files are being stored or being placed, how the analysis files are being processed. Do you have raw files and processed files? Do you keep all of your whoopsie files in a different place or not for a certain amount of time? All of those kinds of nitty-gritty components. Making sure you are keeping an eye on team access and processes. So sometimes not every member of the team will have access to everything. Sometimes that changes over time and someone needs to kind of manually turn something on or turn something off. Backups are a big part of this phase of research while you're doing collection and analysis, making sure that everything is being taken care of so that you don't lose something, right, while you're in process. This is also the phase that gets really messy in terms of people stop paying attention to the file naming norms and you have to kind of go in and clean those up. People end up having files on their local computers that they shouldn't have. So it's a really good time to just, do a, depending on how long you're looking at, do a weekly check-in, do a monthly check-in, make sure that everybody's playing by the rules. When we're talking about supports, so the Research Data Storage Finder is a tool that we'll talk about in the RDM tools session that's next week. But essentially it gives you a bunch of options of places that you could store your data and some examples of when that would be the right choice. There's more information about the University of Manitoba Dataverse on this Dataverse guide. That's one of our sort of general open repositories. Everybody at the University of Manitoba is able to put stuff there. You all have about 5 gigs of space available to you. We have a couple of questions before we set you up with a project space, but really everybody is able to use that space. So if you're not sure where else to go, that can be a really great place to start. And then if you're really unfamiliar with the discussion that I've been kind of sprinkling through about naming files, talking about documentation, or even looking for where you could find data that already exists, the data creation section of the RDM guide might be a nice place to kind of skim through. So it's a long document with a bunch of different sections. And so data creation's in section 3. So making data broadly available is the third phase that we're talking about. This is often, you're writing a paper, you're publishing, maybe you're publishing a book, maybe you're presenting at a conference, you're defending a thesis, you're publishing some code. So data in this context is very, very broad. So making your work available, that you've finished the analysis, you've come to some conclusions, and you're sharing it out along with the whatever sort of knowledge production you've created. You're also maybe considering sharing your data. So the publisher you've chosen for your project is asking for supplemental files. There's a requirement to post to a repository, or maybe it's a norm in your subject area to post for data reuse. You may also, if you're working with human participants, you may have put in your documentation, in your consent forms, in your recruitment files, that you would share your outputs with your participants. That's quite common. So if you've done a survey on, I don't know, people with allergies of a certain variety, you might have said, hey, in return for participating, you will get early access to the information that we find. And obviously, if they're someone with a specific affliction, they would want to hear as much as possible. What are you going to do about it, right? So that can be part of this making your work available stage. When we're talking about research data management corollaries, a lot of this is about publishing decisions. So it does come into play in terms of research data management if you're focused on that open science, open access component. So if you are interested in sharing out your work as widely as possible for ethical reasons, that includes data sharing, but it also includes picking a journal that has an open access option or is fully open access. Presenting at a conference that will record your session and share it on YouTube so that you can give somebody a link, right? Those kinds of considerations sort of run alongside. And then obviously when you're talking about sharing your data, that is very much inside of the RDM wheelhouse, thinking about repository choices, data documentation, and cleaning your data. So you've probably done some making sure that your data, well, you will definitely have done a bunch of data cleaning when you first uh, brought that data into your project, made sure that it's, maybe if it's a spreadsheet, make sure all your columns are identified, make sure there's no empty cells, those kinds of things. But when you're sharing out your data, you want to make sure that you're sharing it for an audience that isn't just you, that isn't just your team that can know what question 4 was on the survey, right? So you want to think about documentation and sharing your data in a way that is actually useful for you a couple of years down the line, or for anybody who's coming into the project at this stage. So supports, there are a number. I've listed the repository services choices here. This is sort of a broader look at what repositories can host data, and a number of subject areas have specific repositories that they work with. So there's a couple in health, there's a couple in various sciences. And so if you're working in a field that has that, you probably want to be where your other people are, right? So you may want to take a peek at repository services guide, just to get a sense of what the larger landscape is. You may want to come back to the Finder or the data creation guide. And then I've linked here a couple of examples of data that have been published in the University of Manitoba Dataverse. So the first link is some results and instruments. The second link is a survey that's been shared. And then the third one is an interview recording, and it's a locked file. So it is shared, but you have to ask for access so that it's not just everybody can see it for any reason, but you have to kind of have a conversation with the research team, which is another way to share in a slightly more controlled way, right? The fourth stage is data retention, preservation, archiving, and long-term access. This is a phase that obviously we are quite concerned about. I don't know how often this is a really distinct phase for researchers, but what I'm talking about here is, even if you haven't shared, making sure your project is all packaged up, you've looked at compliance for any of your regulations. So if you've gone through an ethics approval and said, I'm going to keep my data for 10 years, or if I'm going to destroy my data after 5 years, you're making sure that you're going to comply with those kinds of responsibilities. So when we're talking about research data management, this is a really good time to review your data management plan. Hopefully you've looked at it more than once since the very beginning, but making sure that you've fulfilled your intentions and requirements, or have a good reason for not having done that. You may need to consider moving your data for long-term preservation. So for example, if you hosted your data in SharePoint, but only one person's going to keep it long-term, you would move those data files into that person's OneDrive, right? And then remove everyone else's access so that it's not just out there floating in the world and a little more vulnerable in that way. And any of the activities from the sharing component that haven't been completed because you didn't decide to share out widely, you still want to kind of make sure that your files are nice and clean so that if you do have to come back to them, you understand what's going on, all of those kinds of things. We do have a guide to self-preservation. It was developed by my colleague, Natalie Vielfer, who's super great at this kind of work. And I do want to mention that when I'm talking about data deposit, doesn't necessarily correlate to data sharing. And so that kind of harkens back to that tri-agency requirement, where we're talking about everybody being required to deposit their data. It doesn't necessarily mean sharing. So when I go back to that interview recording, this one, and I guess I'll just open this up. We have a little bit of time here. So this is what this looks like. I can see a bunch of information about this work without getting to watch the interview, right? I can see who posted it, what year they did this in, who the interview is between. When I look at the information on the actual file, I can see that it's 1.6 gigabytes. So it's probably about an hour, something like that. I can see the date that it was performed, and then it was published a little bit later, and that there have been no downloads. So nobody has received access. But if I did want to contact the owner and kind of have a conversation about a situation where I would like to use that work, there's a button on the Borealis site that allows you to get a hold of Sarah Ramsden and kind of have that conversation, right? So that's one way to consider complying with data deposit requirements that isn't necessarily about data sharing. If people have questions about that kind of stuff, I'm happy to talk about it once we're through these slides. Okay. And the very last stage, project closeout and compliance. Again, I think this stage doesn't always feel distinct, but it's really worth spending a little bit of time on. So making sure that your funding reports are in, maybe you're required to share some DOIs about, did you comply with the open access publication? Did you comply with a data deposit? Closing out your ethics forms if you are in an active ethics agreement, reviewing those digital files and access. So at this stage, you can probably dump all of those whoopsie files when you were working on your analysis. You're not going to go back to those, right? And maybe you're going to have a team party. I hope you're having a team party at this stage. So RDM considerations for this stage are making sure you have DOIs for the content that you need them for, you're reviewing your files, and a very last check through your DMP to ensure that all your intentions are carried out. And the last thing I'll mention is that I think it's a really good time to spend even like 10 minutes thinking about what worked and what didn't in your processes, and how can I make it better next time? Or what did I end up doing that didn't make it onto the DMP that was really useful or worked well for my team? I say that because most people will reuse their DMPs, and so it is worth spending that time to clean them up. Natalie and I just did a workshop about closing out a project. It's called All Good Research Comes to an End. It is going to be posted on the University of Manitoba YouTube page. It's not there yet. It's just being formatted, but you'll be able to find it there pretty soon, and we may rerun it in the spring. Okay, we've made it through the whole project. So this is just a quick snapshot of the 4 phases or 5 phases, and making sure that you're kind of checking all the stuff off your list. So if you found the last bunch of slides just too much, this is a nice little snapshot of what we've talked about today. Before we go, I want you to consider your RDM practices early and often. I want you to be as explicit and transparent as you can be within your team, and also sharing out if that's part of your process. And it's really helpful to document decisions, processes, and roles. So if you're in a conversation where you've made a decision, write something down so that A, the people who weren't in the room know what you decided, but also so that you can refer back, right? I'm really happy to discuss any of this content personally as you're developing your own projects, as you're working through requirements, anything like that. So my appointment link is here. You'll also get an email from me after the session is over with the slide link again, and then also with the YouTube link once that's posted. So I mentioned that we have 2 research data management tool projects sessions coming up. So RDM Tools is next Tuesday on the 19th. It's at noon as well. And we're really going to get into the Finder, DMP Assistant, and University of Manitoba Dataverse. And then on the 28th, again at noon, 28th is a Thursday, we're going to go through writing a DMP. So I'm going to look at some of those templates. We're going to get into DMP Assistant, and practice writing something based on a case. There's a number of relevant workshops from the University of Manitoba libraries. A lot of them have already happened for this term. We're kind of wrapping things up because you guys are getting into end of term projects, exams, all of that kind of work. We'll kick up another workshops sort of session. Usually we start them in February and end them by end of March, early April. But the examples of some things are closing out a project, which I mentioned, preventing data loss, which Natalie did, which was really good. There's also an introduction to OSF, which is one of the repositories that we support. It's called Open Science Framework. So the registration link here is at the top for any of our sessions coming up. And then what I've linked to under the other relevant workshops is our YouTube page. So everything pretty much gets posted to the YouTube page afterwards so that you can look at it. One caveat of watching the video versus coming to the session is you don't get that co-curricular record, right? Before you go, I would really love it if you had a couple of minutes to fill in this little survey. It's very short, and if you've attended some of the other sessions, you'll have seen this already, but it really helps us figure out if we need to change content, if people are in a different place than we expected them to be, all of that kind of thing. So an evaluation form is there, and I popped the link into the chat. I'm happy to take questions. We still have 5-6 minutes. I'll wait until you guys are over. I'm going to stop the recording now, and then we can just have a conversation as needed. Okay.